an old friend in the postmodern sense. I've known him for almost a year now, probably a little more. And I met him for the first time today, which is, really old as things go. I don't need to introduce him to you. You all know very well what he's about. And the subject of the Indian rupee, which is the subject of his talk, is a fascinating subject anyway. It's been given trouble ever since Oscar Wilde first mentioned it. And this whole of the last 20th century, we wondered what's wrong with the rupee. Why doesn't India have a hard currency? Why does it keep going down? What is it exactly that makes the rupee such a fickle source of value, store of value? Dr. Roy, I'm sure, will enlighten us with what his views are and how and what and why of the Indian rupee. And I think he expects to speak for about 45 minutes to 1 hour. And after that, there'll be question hour, time for questions. And we can give it at least half an hour for that, or 15 minutes, depending on the questions we receive. Some of you might like to, if you have more than one question, to note them down as he speaks and then pass them on to me, so that as soon as the talk is over, we can get to the questions immediately. So without further ado, I hand you over to Dr. Roy.
Thank you so much. May I thank the Indian International Centre for this very warm invitation. A very warm invitation, and especially my old friend Gigi Bhattacharya has to be mentioned. She didn't want to be mentioned, but she is, because it's really at her initiative and with her support that this is happening. I'd also like to thank BRS for agreeing to chair it at short notice. This is the first time I'm back in Delhi since 2003, when I was the guest of the late Gopi Arora, my old friend, and I miss his presence today. He would have loved this talk. The last time I did any economics in Delhi was with the late Rajiv Gandhi in 1991. And I miss his presence in current Indian politics very badly, as I do Siddhartha Shankar Ray's, who introduced me to him. And with your permission, I should like for a moment remember my father as well, whom I lost this year. There is a partition story, how he, as one of the last government officers in Karachi in August 47, handing over a supply office to the new Pakistan, helped save the Sindhi refugees from a threatened massacre by reporting their plight when he got back to Delhi to his minister, who was Shyama Prasad Mukherjee. And Mukherjee then asked him to write a report, which he did, and then the Nehru cabinet the next day ordered 3 frigates from Bombay to Karachi, and the Sindhis came home safely. So I'm glad that my dad would be very happy to see me here. His old friends and colleagues from the Foreign Service are present, but he'd be very worried that I'm going to be too harsh towards the government of India, which he loved very much. The historical facts, data, and results that I propose to present to you are part of a very long-term research program, which has been with me for 30, 40 years, certainly since I came back to India in 96, when I became professor at IIT Kharagpur. But then there were lots of adventures before that in England and America. And I say all this because it finally ended up with Rajiv Gandhi in 1990. Part of the work ended up with Rajiv in 1991 and changed the thinking of his party. I say all this because what I'm going to propose to you today does not mean that anything is beyond logic or fact or interpretation. I am planning, this is an ongoing program where the complex reality of India over the 20th century, the economic reality of certain important variables like inflation and like monetary supply and like real income and the debt, all of these are very complex variables which I'm planning to put a very long-term perspective on. And it's only, and you won't get this, nobody else has apparently done this. This is a technique of quantitative economic history which is really pioneered by Friedman and Schwartz in America. And what I'm planning to do is reveal to you some of these results, some of which are quite clear and some of which are quite decisive. And they can only be seen once you've got a long-term perspective. All right, so paradoxes lead to discoveries, and the first paradox I'd like to point to is that free sovereign India has never had a freely convertible world money to its name. Now, why that's a paradox, in my view, is because India was one of the victors who signed the Treaty of Versailles in June 1919. The signature is actually Bikaner's, Maharaja Bikaner somewhere there, I think, who signed on behalf of as a victor against Germany, Germany of the Deutschmark and Euro fame. So India was a victor in the First World War. and we did sign there as such. And then we were an original member of the League of Nations. That came with signing the treaty. You'll find India's name somewhere as part of the British Empire, but was still there. And the First World War was actually very good for India, quote unquote, in a way, economically, whereas the Second World War was a disaster. But the Treaty of Peace, so-called, which was the Treaty of Versailles, was destined, of course, not to be a treaty of peace at all. And Maynard Keynes condemned it immediately, and I will quote from him again. We were also an original member of the IMF, and we sent a delegation to Bretton Woods, and the founder of this institution, that's C.D. Deshmukh, in fact, right there, who was the third governor of the Reserve Bank and was also later the founder of the IIC, with the other delegates of the Indian delegation. We were at the 1945 UN conference, the San Francisco conference before the UN got created, which became the UN. And this is Feroz Khan Noon, who later became Prime Minister of Pakistan, in fact, who was, I think, the defense member of the Viceroy's Council. So India, being a member of the League of Nations, signing the Treaty of Versailles, an original member of the UN, original member of the IMF, and yet we do not have a currency 60, 70 years later which is able to hold its own with the major global currencies of the world, like sterling, dollar, the yen, and now the euro. Now, Nehru writes to his daughter in 1933, you find it in Glimpses of World History. He says, "The story of the poor rupee in India is a long and sad one from India's point of view. The rupee has been made to serve the interests of the British government and British financiers." This is Nehru, 1933. And we'll see that he was right, especially after 1939. But the problem is, unfortunately, the story of the poor rupee in India, in independent India, has remained a long and sad one after the departure of the British. It might even have become rather worse. The rupee has been made to serve the interests of the government, especially the military, plus big business and the commercial and intellectual elite, and also NRIs, of which I was one. The rupee has never been permitted to this day to serve the economic interests of the ordinary Indian. If Mr. Kejriwal is here, we tried to get through to him. The Aam Aadmi and Aam Aurat have not been represented at all. Their economic interests have been absent in all discussion of the rupee, and you'll see why in a minute, I hope. Now, I don't know if you know, but it surprised me to find out that there are 18 million people employed in all Indian government. All governments, all agencies, comes to 18 million people, or 1.8 crores. And there are 12 million people employed in the entire organized private sector, which is quite a small number if you think about it, 1.2. So that's 30 million people total. With 4 dependents each, let's say that's 150 million in total, having something to do with either the government or the organized private sector. That leaves 850 million people, and who do not rely on their incomes on either the government or the organized private sector. Let me call them the Aam Aadmi. And for me, the rupee becomes a hard currency when any of the 850 million people of India, or anybody else, any resident in India, can walk into a bank and open and maintain an account denominated in foreign currencies and precious metals, paying costs as they go along, and commissions. And why they may want to do that is either because they want to make a payment abroad for a foreign liability, or they want to save present income safely for consumption in the future without fear of capital loss from inflation, from government-induced inflation. In other words, they may want to either you want to pay for an import or pay for somebody's education or travel, so you pay a draft in my system. Now, for that you would get charged a commission. You might even get charged costs, and you might even get charged taxes. So it should not be, in my system, it should not be a situation where there is an easy incentive for people to want to get out of the rupee and into foreign exchange. The rupee, on the other hand, in my system would earn interest, whereas the foreign exchange account would not earn interest. But at the same time, the rupee is subject to government-induced inflation, as I said, where the abuse of money is what might induce somebody to move from the rupee to a set of foreign currencies. Now, it seems to me that is an aim that we have to have. If we tried it today or tomorrow and everybody moves to foreign currencies, then obviously there's a collapse of the rupee and we can't do it. It's not feasible. But if we aim to, it needs to be a national aim, and I would say a national aim over 5 years. So it's a 5-year plan, very different from the kind of 5-year plans that this city has been used to. But without such a national aim, the integrity of the currency continues to be damaged by governmental abuse. I don't mean the central government alone. I mean all the state governments do not create their own money, but all their debt comes and piles up with the union government as well. Specifically, the banking sector ends up holding vast, untold amounts of government debt, which are not able to be valued at world prices. So if you don't know what the asset side of the banking sector is, you don't really know the values of the banks, then you don't know the values of the securities markets, and then really speaking, all nominal assets in the economy, you don't know what their world prices are. So that is the kind of uncertainty that has been put into the system. And beyond that, inequalities are enhanced. And I think when I gave this talk at the Reserve Bank in 2005, one of the top economists said, "Oh, we've got convertibility already." And I said, "We don't. What we've got is we've got lots of barriers. You have to have very expensive contract lawyers from Bombay and Delhi to be able to get foreign exchange for what's called external commercial borrowing and so on. So inequalities are enhanced with a government corporate NRI elite engaging in apparently government-induced capital flight. So this is all very strange. So free India has never had a freely convertible world money, nor has the Islamic Republic of Pakistan. But what the heck, we do have plenty of nuclear bombs to explode. We have armies which have expanded from 23 divisions to the height of World War II to 50 divisions now. Many thousands of tanks, airplanes. We can fight each other very well. But we don't have currencies which are worth very much, either them or us. And if we look at per capita real military expenditure in India, it zoomed, relatively speaking, when the Japanese invaded. Japanese invasion during World War II, that was the time that it really zoomed. And in real terms, it zoomed again. You see, as you can see, from the 65 war, 71, Rajiv Gandhi brass tacks, and then post-Pokaran as well. Per capita, as percentage of national income, again, it zoomed from 1.5 at the height of the war to whatever it is now. Nominal military expenditure without the inflation. I will go through the graphs again and again, so please don't be worried if you don't miss it again. We'll come back to them as many times as you want. So in nominal terms, it's exponential. The other thing that happens during the war, the British do three things in 1939, which my thesis is continues afterwards in independent India in exaggerated form. The first thing they do is they clamp down draconian exchange controls on the whole sterling area, principally with respect to the dollar. Because those days shipping was very limited and shipping space, so import controls and exchange controls come 1939-40 because of the war. And before that, between 1834 and 1940, India is a trade surplus country, traditionally. We were always the only thing India imported was metals practically, but exports are massively greater than imports during the 1834 to 1940. From 49 to 2003, it's been reversed. So we've now become a classic merchandise deficit country. And the three things the British do is, one is they clamp down exchange controls. This is what I'll argue. The second is they massively increase military expenditure, which I've mentioned. And the third thing they do is they monetize the deficit. And that monetization of the deficit is actually the worst thing possible, because then you've got monetization of the deficit with the exchange control causing the problem that we have today. And that process is one that I have not seen anybody in any of the institutions, not the bank, not the fund, not the government, not the planning commission, not any of the properly address in the manner it needs to be addressed. Maybe I'm wrong. Government merchandise imports and exports as percentage of the total. So government controls during the war. The government controls imports, and then continues after the war to do the same. So the war economy essentially becomes the socialist economy, or the pseudo-socialist economy, as you wish. There is a surplus of trade and services between 49 and 90, as you know, because we are able to export labor very well all over the place, and that really keeps the balance of trade not so bad. I'll come back to some of this later. Now, the other reversal that happens is a very peculiar reversal, which is that we would expect India as a relatively labor abundant. We've got lots of people, and we don't have as much capital, relatively speaking. We've got some capital, but not relatively speaking. We are labor abundant, and we are relatively speaking capital scarce compared to the West. And if that was the case, from naked eye, you can see that there's more people here than there is relative to capital in, let's say, England or America or anywhere else. We expect that wage rates, or the relative price of labor, will be lower in India than in the West. And we expect the interest rates, or the relative price of capital, will be higher in India than in the West. Now, in the unorganized sector, real rates of interest are extremely high. If you borrow money, it's actually about 1% per day, 1% per week, 2% per month, and so on. Very, very high rates of interest, still continuing in the unorganized sector, which one does not hear about in the pink business newspapers in India. But something very strange happens, because what happened normally between 1864 and 1926, right through the gold standard, what you've got is you've got Indian interest rates being systematically higher than London interest rates, as you'd expect, because we are capital scarce, relatively speaking, and they are capital rich. We are labor abundant, and they are labor poor. So in the classic, but we then get a reversal between 1975 and 1992, let's say. If you look at U.S. Real interest rates, they are systematically higher than Indian real interest rates. I put Indian real interest rates in brackets. In other words, something very strange has happened, that we've made wage rates have been naturally lower in India, but we've also made the price of capital low. So what we've got is obviously, if there are only two factors, capital and labor, they can't both be relatively cheaper in India than in the West. But somewhere along the line, capital became cheaper, quote unquote, in India than in the UK, US. And the repression of real interest rates has led to this capital flight of 10 million Indians nomenclatura. Everybody here has got somebody abroad out of 1 billion Indians. So there's been a capital flight in a way. And at the same time, anyway, I'll come back to that if I can. Now, what I'm going to focus on is money, principally, and not on interest rates or trade. And the institution of money is very, very peculiar, because we're looking at ultimately the rupee versus foreign currency, and we have to figure out what goes into the motivation of the demand for these things. And the institution of money, to the economist, is very, very peculiar. Both its supply, its demand, its value, its use, and mostly its misuse. Because unlike real goods like rice or wheat or telephones or anything else that you can mention, shoelaces, money has no intrinsic worth. So I used to teach students, you can't really do anything with the paper. The paper is not worth very much at all. And yet it has value for everyone. So this is the big paradox of money, as to how something which is intrinsically useless, whether it is cash or deposits are invisible as well, but whether that something which is intrinsically worthless or intrinsically useless still acquires value because people believe in it. Now this is a picture which is and the lesson I want to bring in here is the German hyperinflation. This is the German hyperinflation, and a woman burning notes, Deutschmarks, Reichsmark, whatever they're called, that you can't eat money or wear it, but you can use it as a fuel in these circumstances, very peculiar and rare circumstances in 1921-23, which was the worst monetary collapse that anybody's ever seen. And here this woman is burning notes. And you've got all these stories of how you had to use wheelbarrows of cash to buy a newspaper back in Germany between 1921 and 23. And this is children playing with blocks of money, worthless money, in Germany in 1921-23 again. So in a sense, I would, it's a salutary warning about where the worst experience can take us. Now this is all in logs on the side. So if you remember your logs, it's all 10 to the 2 is 100, 10 to the 3 is 1,000, and this is going up to 10 to the 1,000, 10 to the 12. And it's going up very rapidly. So this is a log scale where you've got 12 zeros after the 1, and that is how the biggest collapse of the German mark and its attendant rise in prices and the exchange rate with the dollar. Now everyone from India's super wealthy businessmen like Mr. Ambani to street children who are begging at the intersection, they have to have money temporarily. They have to hold it. This intrinsically worthless thing has to be held, at least momentarily or temporarily. And it has no use itself. And of course, why they hold it is because money is a medium of exchange. We need it for wages to be paid, rents to be paid, and consumption to happen. We need it as a store of value, which means that you have to transfer purchasing power across time and place, both across from now to the future and also from one place to another, and of course as a unit of account, so that we don't have to use steel or cheese to count prices in. So money acquires value because people mutually believe it to be valuable, and they believe it will trade for real goods and services. If that belief is lost, money's value is lost as well. Inflation in India is a very, very interesting story, and this graph has never been seen before, other than in my work as far as I know. And what it says is that the highest inflation, as I said, the highest degree of monetization occurred in the war, Second World War, between 1939 and 42 roughly. And that is the highest growth of the British essentially printed money in order to pay for war finance. Now, Amartya Sen, who I go back a long, long ways. He's on the left, I'm on the right. But anyway, he wrote a book on famines, but I didn't see any reference there to the possibility that the British, and nobody else has done this research either, the British actually had a very hard view of the Indian national movement in 37, 38, 39, 40, 41, 42, and they took it out on monetary policy, partly. So there was a massive inflation, which the first governor of the Reserve Bank allowed. The second really caused it, and then Deshmukh went to great lengths to get rid of the second man and then reduce it. And what you see here is a pre-war period where prices are fluctuating in India. There is no systematic monetary policy. There is no Reserve Bank in this period here. I should read from this, I think. There's no Reserve Bank during this period. And you see Indian prices rising in response to world prices, the US Civil War. Then during the First World War, again they rise, and they collapse with merchandise commodities prices collapsing. And then you have this enormous increase in money supply, and the British teach us how to monetize the deficit, incidentally. So that's what they do, and that procedure is going to be continuing. And then post-war, there is no further deflation. It's always inflation. I'll come back to all of this again. So this is money supply growth and prices zooming up in the war and then continuing fairly high afterwards. Now, Keynes, famous Keynes, never visited India, but his first book in 1913 was Indian Currency and Finance, was on India at the age of 30. It's an excellent analysis. And what Keynes observed was India had stumbled into, in the 20th century, it's 100 years ago, this is 1913, this is now 2012, it's 100 years ago that this book is still relevant. It's quite remarkable. And that what he did was he found that there was a modified goal that chanced to fill a normative goal known since Ricardo, meaning that this is what I call the Keynes-Ricardo dictum. I'll just leave this aside, I think. And the Keynes-Ricardo dictum is simply that the currency media used in the internal circulation, meaning all the rupees that are, this is 100 years ago, being used internally in the country, are confined to notes and cheap token coins, which are made to act precisely as if they were bits of gold, by being made convertible into gold for foreign payment purposes. So Keynes is suggesting that by all means have an internal circulation with a lot of money, a lot of cash, to expedite real transactions. And real transactions are obviously very important, and otherwise you don't have economic growth, for that matter. Now, incidentally, this is the problem that I've brought up with Greece. It'll come back. Maybe I'll come back to it. That Greece is now short of a transactions medium, and that is why they're collapsing even further, because the euro is far too expensive a currency to use as medium of exchange. Now, World War I left India very well off externally, economically as well, macroeconomically. World War I, World War II was different. But World War I, at the end of 1918, we have a big, massive surplus on the export front. We have massive official foreign reserves. And this is very different from the foreign reserves we have now. It's salutary that China's foreign reserves have gone zooming up over the last 20, 30 years because they've been exporting manufactured goods for 30 years. You know, if you were in the States in the 80s, if you remember, you would find Walmart and Kmart all filled with Chinese goods like umbrellas and overcoats and boots and simple, very low technology things which everybody needed were all coming from China. So China was establishing real markets, and because of its export surplus, that is why they've got foreign exchange reserves, which are as high as they are. Ours, unfortunately, are not that. We've got high foreign exchange reserves, but that's because we've borrowed the money, mostly. Mostly Indian businesses borrowed the money. I'll come back to that too. But back in 1917-18, we had a massive export surplus, and we had a massive official reserves. Of course, being controlled by the British, and the British ruined that in due course. And we have a budget surplus too. In unfree India, as I call it, before 1939, 1939 is the big year that everything changes. The rupee, though legal tender only on the subcontinent, was actually what I've called a super convertible currency, because everybody allowed, even though it wasn't legal tender from the Middle East, from Iraq to Singapore to Australia, the rupee was accepted in trade and even in stock markets. And each person, why people accept money is because, as Friedman and Schwartz said, is because they accept it because they think that everybody else is going to accept it. And they think that because in their experience, that is what has been their experience. That people accept money, which is intrinsically worthless, to remind you again, because they are because they think that it's going to be given over for something which is real, like housing or food or labor or whatever. So the value of intrinsically worthless pieces of paper money, arises from the trust and confidence people place in them temporarily when making their purchases and their transactions with each other. Now this was Ulysses and the Sirens. About 30 years ago, a man called John Elster, who's now a professor at Columbia, he was a young man then, as we all were, and he came to give a talk with James Buchanan in Virginia, where I was. And it was about Ulysses and the Sirens. And I didn't understand what was going on. And then I suddenly remembered this doing this talk. Whereas Ulysses asked, there's something called a Ulysses Pact, where Ulysses asked his men, before they met the Sirens on their voyage, to put wax in their ears because they didn't want to be tempted by the Sirens. And then Ulysses said, please tie me to the mast before we meet them, so I'm not tempted by their beauty and their music. So convertibility of a money used in domestic trade is, I would say, an example of a Ulysses Pact. Other Ulysses Pacts occur in medicine and so on. Ulysses asked his men to put wax in their ears and to tie him to the mast so that he wouldn't be tempted by them when the ship went by. And everyone agrees that money is open to being debauched by governments, and what governments need is not to fall for the temptation of debasing money by creating a quick and invisible means of taxing, let me call them the masses. So Britain's Hugh Dalton, who seems to have influenced a lot of Indian public finance at some point, he was, I think, their Treasury Secretary or the Chancellor. He said, the use of the printing press to manufacture legal tender paper money to pay government creditors, either directly or indirectly by creating a loan to yourself from the central bank. That this was a way to finance deficits. He was Chancellor for many years. I think about 1945 or 50 is when he wrote this. Now this is, I promise you no equations, but if government expenditure, net of operational income of the government, so net of operational income meaning whatever Air India gets for passenger fares is operational income, or whatever you get from school fees or from parks and so forth. So if we net that from government expenditure, that is G. And T is total taxation. All the taxes collected everywhere. So if G is greater than T, and we have, the state governments do not create money, as we know, then what, the government's got a deficit, essentially. And the government has to borrow that to meet that. And it's either borrowing using the existing stock of debt, or it's printing money. There's no other way. That's the government budget constraint. And you do not see, I don't see the government budget constraint being ever mentioned in anything in India, in any of the discussion in the pink papers or anywhere else. Whereas G minus T would imply a surplus where the government lends to others, whether at home or abroad. Now, to give you an example, this is under Manmohan Singh in 1994-95 when he was finance minister. I've just done it for a few years. This is the expenditure the government made in those terms, in 1295 rupees billion. A billion is what, 100 crore? Or 100 crore? 10 crore? 100 crore. And then, of which direct taxation was 184. That's income tax, wealth tax, and so forth. And indirect miscellaneous taxation, excise and all that is 491. So you're left with new borrowing of 660. Out of 1295, which is almost 50%. Or maybe it's more than 50%. This was 94-95 under Manmohan Singh as finance minister. Taxation via inflation does not require detailed legislation, so it's very easy. All you do is you create money, so much money, that the real value of the money that is there is devalued. And I'll explain that in a minute. The resulting inflation automatically is a tax on the cash balances. So even street children, I'm afraid, are taxed in this indirect way that, if they earn 30 rupees a day and you tax them and you inflate the currency at 25 paise a day or whatever, then you are taxing them very, very slightly by reducing the real value of the income that they make. Now, to those who have no economics at all, and friends of mine have agreed that who have no economics at all, that this example helps. Suppose you have 1 lakh of rupees, 100,000 rupees. That's very easy. And you have a nominal interest rate, meaning the money, if you lent it to the bank, then you would get 10%. So normally you would expect that 10%, that 100,000 will become 110,000 after a year. That's quite normal to expect. But suppose hypothetically inflation is running at 20%. In that case, the money prices of real goods and services is increasing at 20%, or the real value of the money, which is because prices, after all, are prices measured in money and expressed in money. it's falling at 20, so you would have the real price of money falling at 20%. We'll come back to questions after all this. Then the 110,000 is what you get nominally, but that declines at 20%. So you're actually being taxed, and you're left with 88,000 in real terms. So if you said the 100,000, what is the inflation tax? Who is making that? That is the person who's created the money, namely the government. And this is, very, very simply and crudely, this is the way the deficit is actually financed. So it's not as if, at the end of the day, Mr. Chidambaram or Pranab Mukherjee or somebody, the finance minister says, right, this is the expenditure, this is the taxation, this is the deficit. But they don't go on to the next stage, saying what is happening to that deficit? Where is that coming from, as it were? Or what happens to it? And what is happening to it is essentially that you are borrowing somewhere along the line such that you have a real budget constraint in real terms, which you have to meet. So you create it. Now everybody agrees to this. Delhi is famous for a university which is very close to Lenin, so I thought I'd bring in Lenin to the picture. Lenin, Keynes, Milton Friedman, everybody. Center, middle, left, right, everyone agrees. And this is a long quotation from Keynes. If you don't mind, I'll read it out. It's from Keynes, 1920. And Keynes says, Lenin is said to have declared the best way to destroy the capitalist system is to debauch the currency. And by a continuous process of inflation, governments can confiscate secretly and unobserved an important part of the wealth of their citizens. By this method, they not only confiscate, but they confiscate arbitrarily, because we don't know who you're taxing in a way which is completely arbitrary. As inflation proceeds, the real value of the currency fluctuates, and the ultimate foundations of capitalism become so utterly disordered, and it becomes a gamble and a lottery, because you don't know what the valuation is at any time. Lenin was certainly right. Keynes says there is no subtler or surer means of overturning the existing basis of society than to debauch the currency. The process engages all the hidden forces of economic law on the side of destruction, and does it in a manner which not one man in a million is able to diagnose. So this is Lenin and Keynes. And we had Kagan. Now this is the supply of broad money in India between 1874 and 2004. In other words, for as long as data has been ever collected. And what broad money is hand-to-hand currency, which is easy to understand. That's all the paper that you have and you've seen. Plus vault cash, what the Americans call vault cash, the British call till money, which is what the banks hold as cash. And then demand deposits, which are deposits of money which you can get back on demand, and time deposits which will be constrained. Now, what you see is, well, this is the supply of broad money in nominal terms. And this, again, is money supply growth rates 34 to 2004. And you can see, again, the wartime maximum over 50%. And then steady growth of 16, 21, 19, 21, 22% continuing right now. This is real income. So real income has also grown through technological progress and productivity gains. So India is part of the world, and we have a population. Let me see if I've got population too. So real income and real income per capita growing very well. Certainly before independence and after independence is growing better. Now, why is that happening? Are we measuring the same thing? Possibly, possibly not. Probably we are. But there is technological progress after the Second World War. Enormous technological progress after the Second World War, right throughout, not just in India, but throughout the world. The war brought that in. This is population, estimated population of India in millions from 1869 to 2005. Growing populations are good things economically. It means people are living longer, basically. It's not that they're breeding more, but it's because, and the reason they're living longer is because of medicine and awareness and better communications and better transport. That is why longevity increases, and that's why the population is growing. So population is growing, and then partition, we lose that many in partition to Pakistan. And then I predict that Pakistan's population and Bangladesh together would be just moving that forward. Then wholesale price, so if you take out from the money supply, if you take out income growth, because you need more money to finance the transactions that you've got because of the greater income, and if you take out the population growth, you're still left with inflation. And the inflation does tend to become exponential. There is some steady part in the 70s, but after bank nationalization, it tends to become exponential. I'll come back to this. Now, this is the three together. This is real income. This is money supply. And this is wholesale prices, as far as we've got data for. So it seems to me that unless you have a very long-term perspective and you try and get all the data there are, you're not going to get a sense of what the process is that you're part of. I will come back to anything that you want that we show, so there's no need to rush it. Nominal domestic public debt. Now what is happening is money is being issued, debt is being handed over to the banks, and that bank, there's the central bank, and then the central bank, it filters through to the commercial banks. So the asset side of the commercial banks is all debt. It's all government debt mostly. The liability side of the commercial banks is your deposits and my deposits. So the profitability of banks depends on their assets and their liabilities, and on the asset side they're holding government debt of an inconvertible currency. Now, this is public debt as percentage of national income from 1959 to 2004. And it was quite steady, as you can see, up to even the 70s. And then from the mid-80s, it is moving upwards. And I would say, this is 2003, I'd say it's up here now, somewhere. So percentage of national income, public debt being held. Now, this is one rather honest statement that came out in the 10th plan, so-called plan, of 21st December 2002. A half century after planning started, there's only one little statement in thousands of pages produced by the Planning Commission, that the debt is found almost entirely by borrowing. India's public finances inherits the consequence of its fiscal mismanagement in the past. That's an admission from the government as of 2002. I'm afraid it can only be worse in 2012. This is, this economists might recognize as what is happening is that the government has a budget constraint, and time deposits in banks are going up the same as bank holdings of government debt. Now this explains something which, what people talk about India having a very high savings rate. The Prime Minister himself talked about India having a 30+ percentage of savings in Parliament in 2010. I wrote against that, saying that this is a complete and total mismeasurement of both in the case of India and in the case of China. Chinese savings rates have been mismeasured massively. What has happened is there is a massive growth of deposits, financial deposits, in banks. But the reason that is happening, in my view, from the data that I see, is because of fractional reserve banking, which means that a bank, if you go and deposit 1,000 rupees to the bank does not keep that 1,000. It probably keeps about 50 and lends out 950. And it's doing that because it can guess that not everybody's going to come in and get their deposit at the same time. So that is fractional reserve banking. And what happens as a result of enormous government spending in government is you get bank deposits zooming up. So I gave a talk on this as well, which if economists are interested, I can talk about. This is interest paid per capita, so per head. Our population has also grown. So per capita interest on the public debt in real terms. So take the inflation out. So if you take the inflation out, back in 71, we were paying maybe 50 rupees per head on the debt in real terms. This is 94 rupees. So we've taken the inflation out of all this. And by now, this is 2001, it's 600, 700. I'm afraid I'd put it well over 800, probably 900, 1,000 rupees per head in real terms being paid on interest on the debt, which is holding up the banking system. So putting the military and the interest together, and the military, I'm afraid military expenditure in India is an enormous black hole of India's public finance. We've got real payments on military and interest zooming up from 1972. You've got, this is a natural log system, scale, but you've got interest zooming and you've got military expenditure both zooming. Which is why, incidentally, I find it very peculiar to be talking about LPG gas and 3 cylinders and 4 cylinders and 6 cylinders and ripping, clamping down hard on extremely poor people on gas. On diesel is a different thing. Now, this is, the government will talk about gross fiscal deficit all over the place, and so will the business press. What they don't talk about is the rolling over of the debt. Never would you find that being discussed. It's very peculiar indeed, mainly because people don't understand what's going on, I think. What is happening is you've got old debt extinguished. So you owe me 1,00,000 rupees. You come and pay it to me at the end of the year. And then you borrow back that same lakh and you borrow 20,000 more. Now, then do we focus only on the 20,000 or do we focus on the fact that you borrowed back the whole 1,20,000, as it were? So what is happening entirely right throughout is that you've got old debt being extinguished. They have to pay, they come and repay the debt and then they borrow that debt back and more of it. So the difference between the old debt and the new debt is the gross fiscal deficit. And that is growing as well, and I can say it's growing in real terms for that matter. So what I've called it the government borrowing requirement is the whole amount. We're not just the marginal amount, which is the annual deficit, but you need to be measuring the whole thing. This is the government's budget constraint. When I showed this to the Reserve Bank, they were very surprised. And you've got government domestic borrowing requirement, which is what I've just explained, that's gross fiscal deficit plus the maturities. In other words, they're paying back the capital and then they're the principal, and then they're reborrowing the principal again and more. And the other side of the asset side of that is bank holding. So you're putting that, you're compelling the nationalized banks to hold it effectively. And then there's the RBI holding of government debt and what's called increase in high-powered money. Now, I won't bore you too much, but this graph is extremely interesting to economists because if you remember, what money is used for is transactions. Keynes agrees to it, Milton Friedman agrees to it, everyone agrees that you have to have money in order for real transactions to take place. Otherwise, if everyone holds on, then real transactions do not take place, and you've got a situation like Greece. Now, the famous Cambridge equation from Marshall was that you needed as much money as it went up with income. And indeed, if you look at narrow money, which is currency and deposits, going up, and reserves, it goes roughly equal, it's 20% of income. So monetary base, narrow as percentage of national income, that part of that hypothesis is sort of proven. But what happens in India is broad money, time deposits are have zoomed up. And why they've zoomed up is because of this relentless, unending, unlimited, and unexamined government deficit financing. This I call the Rangarajan effect because Rangarajan it was just a matter of how the debt is held. Now, this is very worrisome indeed, and I won't go very much beyond this in terms of my critique of the government. This is very worrisome indeed because this is from 1970 to 98. So this is not a Congress BJP thing at all. This is government. In the processes of government, finance and fiscal and monetary policy. And nobody put this data in. My nephew Nisi, I had two research assistants, one who was 95 and one who was 85, and together we put the data in. And once we got the data in like this, once you graph it, you do see a trend. Now what this is bank liabilities over assets. As you know, assets my nephew's supposed to be a BCom, so I won't tease him with it, but assets are what? Equal liabilities plus equity, right? And if you have zero equity, then your assets and liabilities are out of sync, and your liabilities are increasing relative to assets. Now, banks' liabilities of assets ratio changed in India from 84% as of 1970, when banks are nationalized. You've still got 16% in hand, as it were, as equity of banks. And at some point or other, it becomes 100%, roughly in the mid 90s. And beyond that, that trend is one which is increasing. In other words, how you would see that in the pink business newspapers is some bank or lobby saying you have to recapitalize the banks, and then the government says, yes, we have to recapitalize the banks, so let's put more money into it. Why? Because the banks are not really being looked at, the balance sheets are not being looked at properly. This is the Reserve Bank of India's main liability as a percentage of the main asset. Also, there's a trend going up, which is not very happy, but I'll leave that aside. Now, had the rupee been a hard currency, none of this could have happened, because the vast amount of government debt that's accumulated would have been evaluated at world prices and not at domestic prices. As things stand, the value as I said, the value at world prices, international prices of the asset side of the banking system. In other words, we have your deposits at the liability side, but there is an asset side, which is what the banks are supposed to consider assets. That becomes an unknown. We don't know what it is in international terms. International prices, making the profitability uncertain in international. Of the whole, and if the banking system is uncertain, then you can't tell what the entire securities market becomes uncertain, and that means all nominal assets together. So the path forward, it seems to me, is not difficult. It is difficult, but it's not. I figured it out, and that is to have system-wide improvements in public finance and government accounting, and there's modern information technology to be used, which has not been used yet properly. And then comprehending government liabilities and expenditure, raising their productivity, and institutional changes in public decision-making, which means essentially hiving off the Reserve Bank from the Finance Ministry and disbanding the Planning Division and attaching it to the Finance Ministry. So this is, I think, a goal important enough to create a national consensus. I'll explain this in a minute. Now, the moha that I've invented, I've called it the new moha deliberately, because when news of this talk arose, I've just been invited and just published with a Swiss banking quarterly called GDI Impulse. And their article is coming out in German on 3 days' time, on 6th of December. So they created this design. And the moha that I've invented is nothing to do with the old moha except its connotation of value in the masses, in the minds of masses of people. And it would consist of 75% foreign currencies and 25% precious metals. Now, when they did the design and they said moha 2012, I said, no, you can't do 2012 because if you did that, it would never work. It would have to be 2017. The currencies are 20% US dollar, 5% Canadian, 10% pound, 10% euro, 5% Swiss franc. You can have what you want practically. 10% Japanese yen, 10% Chinese, and a little Australian, and gold and silver. Gold and silver is there just because they have sort of sentimental value and people believe them. Now, we can't do it now because inflation in India and the world economy has been much higher than the average in the world. So systematically. So everyone obviously would move. All of us, everybody in the room would, if I quoted my price for the moha, you'd all say, please give me a moha, you take 50,000 rupees and give me the moha. So we can't do that. Now, this is the hero of the piece, Mr. Premchand of the IMF, who was a very quiet official of the IMF, whom I met in 97 and then 98 again. He signed a copy of this book of his, Effective Government Accounting. He's been in the IMF for decades, and he's now retired in California with his children. And I met him just before that. He, incidentally, is the kind of the guru of both Y.V. Reddy and Subbarao. In fact, Mr. Subbarao was standing outside. He wasn't the governor then. He was introduced to me as a chief, as an important finance official of Andhra Pradesh. And Mr. Premchand said, "Do you want to meet him?" And I said, "No, I should have," but I never did. But Subbarao and Y.V. Reddy would treat Premchand as somewhat of a guru. And Premchand's book is really brilliant because, as you can see, it's called Effective Government Accounting. So I'm going to say that the situation we've got over 100 years is very dismal indeed, but there is a way out of it, as it were. And it requires very candid government accounting and careful government accounting and proper government accounting to start with. And what I've been doing for the last decade and a half or more is figuring out the state budgets. And to give you an example, this is an example of how the state budgets ought to be represented. Using the highest forms of international standards. So here's Maharashtra, Uttar Pradesh, West Bengal, for example. What you got is government and local government, judiciary, police, prisons, bureaucracy, collecting land revenue, taxes. Collecting land revenue and taxes, Maharashtra, 6% of expenditure is weird. It's bizarre, but that's what the CAG numbers are. That's 42.25 billion, 100 crores of rupees going into collecting land revenue and taxes. If you saw that in the numbers, and there are many numbers like this that just pop up, then Mr. Kejriwal should have been chasing after that too. What is happening in the Maharashtra Land Revenue Department? That this is the expenditure coming out. Health, nutrition, and then Uttar Pradesh is something else. Road, bridges, transport, etc. Electricity, 2.41% in Maharashtra, 23.23% in Uttar Pradesh. Heaven knows what's up. But something's up. Something's up for sure. And then again, 6.63% in West Bengal. Just three examples. This is the bottom side. Now, whatever that is, total expenditure of Maharashtra, total expenditure UP, total expenditure Bengal, which is clear to everybody. Anyone, you don't have to explain to the average Indian farmer, even if he may be unlettered in all this, that what's going on would be extremely easy to understand. And then they have tax revenues, they have operational income, they have grants from the union, they get some loans recovered, and that's their total income. So then the states are borrowing. They do the same thing as the union is doing. They are paying back loans and then receiving them again. So you can go further into the detail of using IT, and this is what I've been doing for a decade and a half, begging and pleading for research money without success. IIT Kharagpur didn't give me a secretary when I became professor there in 96, and without any assistance, practically a few volunteers helping here and there. But you can get further into detail. Then the main government, the union government. That too has to be understood. It has to be comprehended. That's the current income, 91 to 2002, for example, current expenditure, what's the investment, what is the government savings, what is the fresh loan expenditure, what is the gross fiscal deficit, how is it being financed. So this is the highest standard that you would get in terms of accounting and easy comprehension of, and everybody has to understand it. Every district in India has to understand what their public finances are. So then this is, if you look at Government of India expenditure, net of operational income, you've got current investment loan. This loan is very peculiar. And you've got different categories again, which again is possible to be done. It's not impossible to be done. Nobody's doing it except me, but it's all my PC, but nobody, but it can be done. So it can be done at an extreme level of detail. Because what information technology is allowing lots and lots of data to be brought under one roof very easily. So you have 28 states, you can have 50 or 100 entities owned by each of them, and it's thousands of entities, and still you could get the budgets on an Excel sheet. So it is not necessary, I repeat, to have a balanced budget. It is absolutely not necessary to do that. You don't have to have G equals T. Or the deficit being zero. The Republicans in America think that's true, but that is not true at all. What you have to have is you have to comprehend what's going on. You have to have a proper professional comprehension of what the structure of government spending is and the structure of taxation. And secondly, you have the nationwide dissemination about these facts. So the whole country has a comprehension. And that comprehension itself will lead to control of corruption. It's just a side effect that if you understand all the accounts, which you can do with modern information technology, so the overall result, what I'm suggesting, would reduce corruption and inflation, and then leave the rupee to become a hard currency. And how it's going to become a hard currency is now, my article is coming out in 3 days, on 6th of December. It's called The Global Money. They did an interview with me on the Mohor 2017 is what I call it. That's fair enough, I said. So what I've said is the Mohor is simply a name. It could be a ducat in America and Europe. But the idea is that it will not be a coin or a note, or it will not be a medium of exchange. You can't go to the bank and say, please give me mohors, which I want to exchange and trade. What you can do is you can go in and put rupees in and get 75% foreign currency, 25% precious metals in an account. And I use the word mohor just because of the connotation. The name means nothing beyond that. And the Swiss got interested because I've never been to Switzerland properly, but there might be an invitation to go now because they got interested because they said, can't it be generalized? And I said, it can be generalized. You can call it a ducat. So this is the interview itself. I'll just finish off with that. Where the question first, as long as I can remember, India's currency has been the rupee. Now you want to introduce a new mohor, so there must have been an old mohor, right? And I said, yes, free sovereign India's currency has been the rupee. My idea merely takes from the old Muslim and British gold coins, just the connotation of value. The rupee is hardly a silver coin anymore, in any case, but it's a fiat paper currency and consists of hand-to-hand cash, vault cash, and deposits. And he says, you want to return to gold coins? I said, no. The new mohor would be a very modern thing. It's just called a new mohor, just for the connotation of value. That's a portfolio in a bank. It would not function as a currency or medium of exchange, but as a unit of account and store of value, even a standard of value for some goods like land and real estate. For example, Singur and Nandikram or Haryana here, land in India has become the new gold because we're in an inflationary environment. So it seems to me that people could ask the farming community, say, look, we will only quote prices in foreign exchange or mohors. I didn't mind if Singur and Nandigram would not be objectionable at all if the farmers were offered foreign exchange or gold as prices, not rupees. Because what happens with rupees is you are essentially cheating. I wrote an editorial on this once, effectively cheating the population, giving them rupees, which you then devalue in price through inflation, which they don't realize until it's too late. Oops, your battery power is low. All right, I'm also done, almost. Do you want to replace the rupee or to complement it, was the question. And my answer is I want to do both. I want to drastically raise the integrity of the rupee as a currency, both domestically and externally. And for that to happen, it needs convertibility. And Milton Friedman had said this in 1955, which was then suppressed by the government of India for 34 years until I published it in 1989 for the first time. Friedman came as an advisor, and he proposed this. He said India should have a convertible currency, which would be on the Canadian pattern, and it would be and of course he was laughed out of court practically, and his memorandum was suppressed, and he sent me the original, which IIT Kharagpur has not returned to me yet. So who shall own the new mohor? Who and where shall it be at central bank? I say the new mohor does not need a central bank, as there is no coin or note in circulation. It's not a coin or a note. It's just a portfolio. Obviously, the banks will have to hold corresponding assets. No institution has to fix the price because it's just a simple addition of market prices of the baskets. And ordinary people, the masses of India, will be able to buy and use and trade it via banks. So they need a bank account? Yes, they will absolutely need a bank account. So as I said, Madhya Pradesh, a rural resident of Madhya Pradesh or Mizoram, goes to a bank, the closest bank or specified banks, and says, I want to open a Mohar account, they say, fine, here, this is what it is. And no, you don't need fancy lawyers, no paperwork. It's a very simple thing. That's my ideal, at least. So what would you need to start this new currency is the question. A government approval, one big bank, or just... I said the critical element is to examine why I propose it. Not what it means, but why I'm saying so. Namely, it's to bring a semblance of integrity to the principal currency, which is the rupee. The rupee is going to stay as the principal medium of exchange. So the idea would be that you want to raise the integrity of the rupee by creating an alternative to it. This is the Ulysses Pact kind of thing. Not only the new Mohar, its existence will help the rupee by making the rupee trustworthy. So my idea is that the rupee holder should be free to convert to Mohars. In other words, to foreign exchange or gold in a bank, especially to pay for foreign transactions liabilities. But that person should not want to hold Mohars, because the rupee itself would be, unless the rupee was being inflated. So I'm saying that it's like Ulysses and the Sirens, where Ulysses, you have a compact where it's an act of self-restraint and self-denial on the part of the government class from using inflation as a tax. At root, that means bringing a semblance of coherence to public finances and government accounting. And once you've got government accounting, public finances in order, you've understood what G and T and all these things are, it's only then that we can proceed. So, because the Mohar is immune to any sort of government abuse. It's 7 currencies and 2 precious metals, so no government can abuse it. So you can save your money. The average Indian might say, look, your rural Indian might say, I don't want IPL. I don't want us to be spending foreign exchange on Ricky Ponting, watching him on TV. I don't want to go to a shopping mall. I don't want to spend foreign exchange on that. I don't want Boeing aircraft. What I want is save money for my children, safely. What we've been doing is taxing the savings away by creating the inflation, so nobody saves nominal rupees. You have to save something real. So that is, we're almost there, in fact. Oh yes, this is the project in Hawaii. This is Milton Friedman who suggested this. This is me. And this is the Indian ambassador, PK Cole, I think, who passed away. This is KB Lal, and this is Ambassador Raina. He was invited, I don't know if he made it. And the results of that came to Rajiv Gandhi through my hand on September 18th, 1990. This is exactly what it was, Rajiv and Chandrasekhar. And I've published on this, Rajiv Gandhi and the Origins of India's 91 Reform. And the whole thing ended with his assassination, really. So that's why I said I rather miss his presence in Indian politics. But beyond that, it's all yours for questions. So I'd be happy to go over the graphs again.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Roy, for a very, very interesting discussion. I think there was a whole lot of material there. I would have happily attended a seminar on this, on the talk today, and it would have been a very interesting seminar too, a very interesting 3-month period. I am intrigued really by a lot of what you said, and there are a huge number of questions that occur to me, but I really shouldn't take up the space that is available to your audience. I'll just ask one quick question and then comment on one aspect, though I have a whole lot of comments, but I won't do that. The first was concerning the Aam Aadmi, the mango people, so to speak. The Aam Aadmi, I think, is not really concerned with inflation, it seems to me, because he gets a corresponding rise in his real earnings. That is, the rickshawala, the labourer, the dihadiwala. So as far as he gets his rupees, which inflation adjusted, he probably wouldn't be too much concerned about the hard currency aspect of the rupee. It is the middle class, the professional classes actually, who are on salaries, who suffer the effects, and government employees not so much now. You mentioned 18 million of them. I thought it was closer to 15, but 18 million government employees now, inflation-adjusted salaries. I don't think they care too much. So there has to be some point at where someone is getting hit, and that is a mystery so far, I think, as to who is really getting the effect of this taxation by stealth. And then, apart from this question, the other one I have is concerning the mohur that you have. I think it's very ingenious. It's a dual currency kind of system, isn't it? And in a dual currency system, would bad money drive out good money, or would government stick to the Ulysses Pact, would it give up its poverty alleviation programs, or even if it doesn't give them up, would it go in for schemes like the food security bill, to my mind, which is a huge expenditure and which will ultimately work to the detriment of the farmer, because if government has these huge deficits, it won't pay the farmer very much to keep its own deficit down. It will impoverish the farmer, the producer. And apart from food security, there are other kinds of programs like, for example, the Rozgar Yojanas, which at least in North India, in Haryana and Punjab, certainly in Delhi, where people are not unemployed seasonally. They are employed throughout the year, and they don't need these schemes. They're probably necessary in Bihar or Jharkhand or places like that. I'm not quite sure where all they're actually useful. But if government is so committed to its programs, then it can't stick to Ulysses Pact. But these are the two questions I had. And any other question that you... Yes.
Dr. Rai, after hearing your very interesting lecture full of historical background, which shows the secular and long-term decline of the rupee's value, especially in the last few years. Obviously, the conclusion is that to make this soft or very soft currency into a hard one, which your lecture says about, it seems to be a monumental task. And the solution you are giving is to have a parallel rupee and mohurs.
Not quite, sir.
Yes. Now, how much are the prospects for making rupee itself a bit less soft or somewhat hard, especially when one sees that in the case of renminbi, they are thinking of, well, people talk of it becoming a reserve currency one day. So what would be very... It's very interesting, and to collect all this.
May I request, before you ask questions, that you identify yourself so that we, for the... Sorry? But right. Mr. Rao, thank you. Mr. Kaul?
Mine is sort of an observation and leading to a question. It seems to me that the plan for the new mohar that you mentioned has to be implemented by the government, right? Now, why would the government implement it? The present system, where the inflation of the rupee is sort of more or less managed by the government, seems to suit the government. There aren't too many people, as you yourself said, who are aware of the long-term effects or even the medium-term effects of it. And those who are aware seem to have been compensated for it by either indexing their incomes or by various other means. And secondly, the leaders of the government, certainly the economists of the government, I'm sure are aware of the problems and the problem that will be created for government policies if the new mohar is introduced. The problems are likely to be that they'll have to curtail expenditure. And how will they be able to curtail expenditure? I mean, either you cut down on Narega, or you cut down on defense expenditure, or, some existing program of the government will have to be cut down, which may be not very feasible, either politically or by the bureaucrats or by the army. So how do you envisage this thing being implemented?
Yes, the gentleman at the back.
So very simple question, sir. How you have gone by, the composition of your new mohar, 20% of USD and other, what is the formula behind that?
Thank you. What I'm trying to do is comprehend. It's a long-term research program, as I said, and to understand and to get the best scientific data that is available together in one honest, scientifically honest series, and then try to figure out the relationships between what is going on. And it's not easy to do so. It's taken a long, long time even to collect the data. I don't agree the government knows what's going on. I don't know anybody in the government, including the Reserve Bank, including the best people at the Reserve Bank whom I respect, comprehend what's going on. I don't see anything from the finance ministry. I don't see, not only that, I don't see anything in the foreign agencies either, the World Bank, the Fund, both of which I worked at, or any government agency. I don't see it coming out of the universities. You know, you'd have expected that if the government was not involved, the universities would be involved. But I don't see that happening. There are various incentives for that not to happen, and I do not know, I don't see it coming out of the business newspapers either. So I think the government is unaware of its financial position. I think foreign creditors have a great interest in figuring out what India's financial position is, because they've lent us money. And if anything, that tends to be rather, as you know, more, well, you should say realistic or pessimistic than what the government produces. People could be, even street children who get taxed by inflation on their small rupees, they may not they would adapt to it. What would happen in rural areas is savings is not held in cash or nominal assets. It's held in cattle, it's held in land, it's held in jewelry. So people move out of nominal assets into real assets. So inflation of nominal assets, paper money and paper money currency and paper money denominated assets is the inverse of real assets. So people will go into real assets, they hold land, they hold wealth, they hold saris, jewelry, and so on, and cattle for that matter. In Kharagpur, we had a gardener who kept informing me of when he bought and sold his cow, depending on what the family's needs were. They were buying and selling cattle accordingly. So the cow and the cattle were the store of value. That is how you stored value. You have to store value for the future. Now, what has happened is government has been, what I've tried to suggest, throughout independence, throughout the war, from Second World War onwards, a process began which has not been comprehended. And that process has required the lack of convertibility of the currency. Because if you didn't have the currency being inconvertible, then the deficit finance would never have survived, because the exchange rate would have crashed, because the valuation would have, you start measuring the State Bank of India's asset side in dollars or pounds, and you try and measure, it's all in rupees, we have to get the right, or you start measuring the import value of military expenditure, of Gorchkov or some fighter squadron or Boeing aircraft, or once the exchange rate is not 50 rupees a dollar, but 100 rupees a dollar, or 120 rupees a dollar, a lot of profitability of the airline industry would be hit straight away. So we expect interest groups to work in their own favor, obviously, and organized interest groups especially. So and that's what happens in India as elsewhere. So organized interest groups have done all right, because they've kind of recognized the situation. My feeling on the whole land question, incidentally, which is tearing this country apart at the moment, is that business communities, organized business communities, have got a very good sense that the hordes of cash money that they're holding are losing value, and what you have to do is get land. However you get land, we don't mind. They could do it in terms of, they could talk about infrastructure, talk about industrial development, whatever terminology is used. It is a matter of getting out of cash and into land, and trying to get somebody to buy your cash and give you his land instead. So that is not an honest way of proceeding in economic policy in the long term. How it comes out, where the crisis would come in a banking collapse. Because the banking sector, if it is mostly nationalized as it is, about 90% of the deposits are all in the nationalized sector. And if the asset side of the banking sector is systematically jeopardized, if not ruined, then you have got a very severe currency problem. I can amplify, if you want, as to what I think happened in '91 and also now with the specific FDI matter, for example. I think there are layers and layers of government, and meaning has to be peeled away. I asked Amaresh Bagchi, who I tried to get Rangarajan to come to Hawaii, and he said Bagchi, and I took Bagchi, and I knew each other, and Bagchi's dead now, but he understood the government finances very well in the 90s. And at a lunch in 92 at the World Bank, I asked him, what was the cause of the crisis in 91, balance of payments crisis? And he said, well, that's very simple. What happened was there was a cash flow problem in foreign exchange because the massive military expansion that happened in the 80s, late 80s, came due. So in 87, 88, 89, all of that money, they sold the arms and then they said you can pay us later. And when that became due, there was a balance of payments crisis. Now, it wouldn't surprise me if the present crisis in the country is a political crisis having to do with FDI of all things, which is, trivial, practically. From an economist's perspective, foreign investment is a good thing. It's not a bad thing. It brings foreign exchange. It brings technology. All these things are good, but it's literally trivial in the larger scale of things. And I do have a story as to why I think that's because I don't think the government has a sense of its cash flow. It needs that $1 or $2 or $5 billion or whatever is coming from FDI in order to pay for other expenditures which is made, without knowing what's going on. So in other words, what I'm really the more is an long-term goal. I don't see it happening. My real concern, as I said in the interview, is to look for integrity or some semblance of coherence, let alone integrity, some semblance of comprehension of what's going on in the accounts. Of government accounting, and therefore, if you don't understand the financial system and the control that is necessary, we can't move on to the monetary system. So in a sense, I don't agree that G and T are understood at all well. And that is what is leading to uncertainty. I would be happy with a deficit. I don't mind a deficit as such if we understand what G is. If we understand what government spending is and how it's structured, if we understand the taxation, we know we can predict the money supply growth, we can predict the inflation, then the moha and the rupee will be fine. The rupee can still be convertible. But what is happening is we don't know government spending, we don't know taxation, we don't know where it's going, we don't know where it's coming from. Then suddenly there's an uncertainty about the deficit, there's uncertainty about inflation, and that ruins real incomes. Coming back to the question of the portfolio, I worked very briefly on Wall Street, and that's how I many years ago, and the US dollar is 20%, Canadian dollar is 5%, that's 25% for North America. Why is the Canadian dollar there? Because it acts as a kind of stabilizer for the US dollar. Europe, 10% pound, 10% euro, you can change that if you want, and 5% Swiss franc, the Swiss franc doing the same thing. So that's 50% Europe and North America. Asia being represented by Japan, 10%, China, it's not a hard currency, but even so, 10% just to nod to the, and 5% Australian dollar. So that's Asia, Europe, America being represented by their major powers. And then gold and silver, gold 20% because everybody likes gold, 5% silver just to play around with it. Gold and silver is really psychological because it is, and it's an important psychological thing but it's still psychological. It's not, a gold standard is an absurdity in the modern world, because the volume of trade is so large, of real trade is so enormous, that it could never be covered by how much gold there is in the world. So it's really a portfolio which is, my aim is to make it immune to inflation by anybody. So that portfolio, if it's offered by a bank, now if I showed you what it involves, and I said, here's 50,000, the current exchange rates, everyone will say, here's 50,000 rupees, give me that portfolio. And if everybody does that, it's a rational thing to do. Obviously the prices are all going to crash. We can't do it. So the situation I want to develop is one in which that portfolio is not something you want. I have the right to, the ordinary average Indian can go in and say, look, I've collected 2 lakhs of rupees for my daughter's education or dowry or whatever, and I want to hold it so that it doesn't decline in value. I don't want to buy land. I don't want to do anything like that. I just want to hold it in the bank so I understand it. And then he can convert it to this new portfolio. If he is afraid of, it's a constraint against inflation of the rupee. So what I'm really after is the rupee becoming hard by the government constraining itself to allowing foreign exchange to be open, the demand for foreign exchange to be open to anyone, and not just to people. Mr. Ratan Tata has borrowed $12 billion in cash to pay for chorus. And if you look at the papers, that $12 billion, which is, as far as I know, still not only a hard currency, but one which is harder than the rupee is. He paid $12 billion in cash for the company which used to be known as British Steel. Now, Mr. Percy Mistry, who was set up in a committee, who chaired the committee that Mr. Chidambaram set up to look into this some years ago, he said, why we need full convertibility is because Ratan and Kumar would not have to go to London to get money. They could get their foreign capital in India itself. As they now have to go to London to get their foreign exchange, poor things. But now they could get it in Bombay itself if we had convertibility. This is entirely different from what I'm suggesting, because I say from '92 to 2012, the liberalization which has happened has led to a false convertibility. A false convertibility meaning we have enhanced inequalities. We have allowed people, to get educations abroad, go and pay for some nondescript university abroad and gain NRI status, and then we've increased the difference between NRIs and resident Indians. What I'm doing is I'm saying that the resident Indian gets the privileges of the NRI. He can go into a bank and open a foreign exchange account. If you do that, obviously the prices of rupee will be different from what it is now, and it will require comprehension of government spending. It will certainly control the military. And I can say that the biggest national security problem India has got is the financial weakness of the economy, which I've pointed to. And if a general of the army was here, I would say, sir, that is much more important than what Pakistan or China or anybody else is. I'm afraid that is the case. Now, what I'm trying to get at is military spending is so out of control, it is so unknown, on the one hand. Plus, we've got the debt, the interest on the public debt on the other hand. Those two are consuming, like sort of cyanide, oxygen, the relationship there. It just consumes everything away. So then you're left with very little for any welfare program, so-called. See, and what I'm saying is that you need to comprehend the budgets, and everybody has to comprehend the budgets. It's easy. It's public finance. So we need district level, state level, panchayat level, and it's information technology. It's the age of information technology. We can do all this on an Excel sheet. We can get it communicated right across the country. So if you remember, why was planning not? A friend of mine said, "Why haven't you mentioned Hayek?" And it's interesting because the old debate about socialism in the 30s between Hayek and von Mises on the one side and the socialists on the other, that was why socialism was knocked and socialist planning was knocked, because of lack of information. So we followed on the Soviet planning, so we've still got a planning commission and planning process going on, so-called planning process going on. But now we've got all the information and all the technology, and we're not using it rightly. So, I think I'm afraid to say that it's rather humorous what's coming out of some of the things that some of the government institutions in this city produce. Humor is not a very pleasant way. So I'm sorry. So what I'm trying to say is comprehend the public finances and communicate that information to the general public, and thereby make it more democratic as a system, and also raise the integrity of the paper money that the government's producing. So I want the Mohar as a kind of Ulysses Pact, where you can tax the Mohar. See, for example, in my system, the rupee would get nominal interest, the Mohar account would not. So if you want to get Mohars, you have to pay a commission, and you just pay a check to your foreign importer as a liability. That's it, which is what you do normally now. You might even put a tax on the Mohar account. So we're providing you the Mohars, you give us we charge a tax for you. But then that is so rupee inflation with rupee interest rate would be where you'd put your money. So I'm raising the integrity of the rupee by creating the Mohar as an alternative, and as a free alternative for everyone, not just for the business class or the government class or academics or whatever. This gentleman there.
My name is Premnath Arya. I used to work for the government of India. My simple question is, whatever the form of government we have today and whatever is happening that everybody knows, so whatever you are suggesting is your philosophy, is your policy. I mean, the government is
Yeah.
Okay. Mr. Maluwale, and I go back for
Suppose this accounting.
things. Yeah.
Where is this inflation coming from?
Well,
If the government
yeah.
doesn't spend more than 30% of the budgeted amount,
Mr.
how is this inflation coming into?
I'm afraid that might be true for a particular department, but overall, believe me, the government's spending much, much more than it's.
No project
it's
takes place in time.
well, we can discuss the numbers for sure. Premchand did this book that I've said, Effective Government Accounting. He glanced at my work in '98 and he said it was light years ahead, quote unquote, of what the government's state of affairs is. To repeat, I just don't think these numbers are well known. I've not received an offer of either assistance or publication to publish all this. I struggled to publish 3 states, Uttar Pradesh, Maharashtra, and West Bengal. I struggled. I was then contributing editor of the Statesman, and it was a big. I thought the Statesman's editor, a friend of mine, would publish it all as big, long as pages, full pages on the data. But it was a struggle to do that. UP and Maharashtra in a way that is incomprehensible. And you know, UP is a country with a state with 110 million people, something like that. Maharashtra is 100 million. Bengal is 75 million. You know, these are large, very large fiscal entities. So what I am saying is that the good news is that information technology does allow a comprehension of all this. I don't see economists of any color at all understanding the IT sector well enough and putting them together. You essentially need for any entity, whether it's a household, a firm, a budget, anyway, you need to know its cash flow position, you need to know its income expenditure position and its asset liability position. That well defines the financial position. Besides the goodwill, if you know that, you have 3 interlinking balance sheets, you've got the financial position of the entity. And what is the role of a finance minister? To see that those financial positions of all the entities that there are under him are not getting worse, at least. You know, first comprehend it, and then try and improve it if you can. Now, that at the state level, first at the state level, at the union level, that has to be done. I'm afraid there are a lot of people employed in the government, but in the finance ministry, nobody's doing it, right? Well, this is why. Well, thank you. So, India International Center has done something different.
Another very quick question, supplementary sort of, if you permit me. The point is you are trying to bring in the gold standard into the Indian.
No, I'm not.
What is this mohar?
The gold standard went out in the 20s.
No, but the mohar is also looking into a certain 25% of precious metal. You can call it
Just-
that's what you are saying.
No, not quite. To repeat, what I'm saying is that the access to foreign exchange, mostly precious, dollars, pounds, euro, yen, Australian dollar, Swiss franc, whatever. Now, the average man in India is not interested in Videshi mudra. See, Videshi mudra, where is Videsh? I don't care. Foreign exchange reserves, I don't care. I do understand gold. So in a sense, gold and silver are there because, the gold standard is out of the question. But Videshi mudra is not something interesting to the average.
Mohar is looking into the basket of currency.
No, what I'm saying is that the average the rupee becomes a hard currency, not when Mr. Tata can get $12 billion, by pressurizing whoever he pressured to get that, or and if you look at the papers, you'll have $300 million being borrowed by Ranbaxy, $400 million being borrowed by so and so. That incidentally is the foreign exchange reserves. How to go back to this? Foreign exchange reserves in India have not grown because of greater manufactured exports. I did the study at the IMF in '93 on India's manufactured exports. Those manufactured exports have grown. Some pharmaceuticals has done well, maybe automobiles, maybe some sectors have done well, IT and so on. But generally speaking, India's balance of foreign exchange has risen because it's borrowed money, and it is not earned coming from exports. China's foreign exchanges have risen because they've been exporting hard stuff, hard real things which are bought in Walmarts and the average American department store. So there is a fundamental difference between the Chinese balance of payments and the Indian balance of payments. And somebody can be cash rich. You or I could be cash rich because you've either earned the money or you've borrowed it. Now, both people are cash rich, but only one has actually earned it. The other has liabilities he has to pay. So India's foreign exchange reserves are mostly, they're very high, but they're mostly borrowed money. Why? Because you've allowed the entire organized corporate sector to almost borrow freely, even if they're not exporting foreign exchange earning things. So you've allowed Indian capital to go abroad and buy companies. We've got my namesake, Subrata Roy, is purchasing the Plaza Hotel in London or New York or somewhere. It's ridiculous. Now, for that he has borrowed $500 million from somewhere, changing rupees, to do that. Now, it seems to me that the elite government and corporate elite have assumed that the rupee is convertible for them, quote unquote, for us, for everybody in this room possibly. You can access foreign exchange for all the needs that you have, to buy this, to buy that, foreign exchange credit card, send your kids abroad or whatever it is. You could do that without difficulty. But that is, as I said, there are 18 million in government, 12 million in the whole organized private sector, that's 30 million, 4 dependents each, there's 150 million people. That is leaving out 850 million people who do not know what foreign exchange is, really. I don't agree that the rickshawala is catching up in inflation with BRS, but we can discuss that over dinner. But so I think that, to go back, it's the integrity of the currency which is at stake, and the integrity of the currency, the root of that is the incoherent, confused state of public finance. Not only the union, at the state, at local level, and that's a pity, because with modern information technology, it doesn't have to be that way. I can see the rupee in 5 years or 10 years. I could make it a hard currency of the world. So you would say dollar, euro, rupee as well. It is not impossible to do. It is not impossible. I can explain how it can be done. I can show the path how it can be done. I'm not going to do it, but I can describe the path how it can be done. And I can argue why it ought to be done, bringing coherence to public finance, and therefore, the Mohar idea is simply a foreign exchange portfolio. I want to raise the integrity of the rupee, so people will not go to the Mohar. So you have, you hold government debt. Nobody holds government debt in India. In America, it used to be, it's not anymore, I'm not sure, but households would hold government debt as treasury bonds for, to save for their kids. Now, none of us would hold our nominal assets in Government of India debt, let alone Government of West Bengal or Government of Punjab debt. So the states themselves, this is very worrisome, because you've got 100 million people in each of these large states. You haven't given them the ability to print money. J&K wants to print, some idea of printing money. I argued in '98 in London, before the euro really took off. I argued for a, quote, reverse euro model. And I said that, what Europe was trying to do was become like India and integrate all their currencies. They didn't want to become like India, they wanted to become like the US, fiscally. But I warned them, I said, look, you might end up becoming like India instead of becoming like the US, which is, I'm afraid, something of what's happened. The reverse euro model was one which even Milton Friedman, my friend, found a little too radical. I did mention at the Reserve Bank, and that was that the large states, Uttar Pradesh, Maharashtra, Bengal, whoever, let's say out of 28 states, you have 15 reserve banks. So you have Reserve Bank of Bengal with Tagore's picture on it. You have, Reserve Bank of Uttar Pradesh with Premchand's picture on it, or whatever, the other Premchand. And you can have the Reserve Bank of Kerala and so on. And those state banks, along with the Reserve Bank of India and the rupee, obviously, but you could allow currencies being created for expediting local real transactions and for paying government wages, state government wages, in those currencies, have a free market for all of that, and coordinated. And those state banks, the state reserve banks, would have the principal aim of running the state deficits. So you'd have, Maharashtra government, UP government, and so on, would have appropriate state banks. And any Indian could travel with rupees, with currency. It would all be a free exchange. You could have the state currencies changing daily. So if you have, for example, Andhra Pradesh or Karnataka, Karnataka has sent a whole bunch of legislators to South America, I think, for something or other. And that comes out in the news. As soon as that happens, the Karnataka rupee would have sunk in my world. Or you have some scam in some state turning up, then that would be a constraint again on the states, where requiring the states to become more fiscally responsible. But that's stage 3. See, stage 2 is trying to get all this. Stage 1 is actually coming to the India International Center. I'm very grateful, as I said again, to the organizers for allowing me to enter this bastion of government privilege, semi-government privilege, and I gave a secret message which is undermining and revolutionary compared to what the government would want.
Well, if there are no more questions, then I think...
I can wait, and you can talk.
Yes.
I was seeing the G and the T, and not the gin and tonic, as I assume, but the G and the T, and you mentioned that, there is this overlapping amount which sort of, is not seen in the next budget, year on year. Now, with the RTI, is there a way of sort of monitoring that and using the data with,
That's a great question. I'm her uncle, in fact, so it's a planted question, I suppose. But what I've been doing is finding the data. It has taken years and months to. The data actually does exist. But you will not, the government, it's almost so obscurely and opaquely done that it's almost as if nobody wants to see the data. See, so the data is actually collected, the CAG's numbers do match up, the account books do match up. But it is in an antiquated, antiquarian, obsolete methodology that is used.
No, there is a big gap, which is there is a black hole in the whole accounting, which
Yes.
is called the unaccounted differences. And it may still be a revelation if I tell you that the whole government of India accounting works on cash basis.
I know that. Oh, I know that very well. I know that very well.
Atrocious.
As opposed to a crow, yes,
One
indeed.
gets aghast at the kind of accounting
Indeed.
done.
So
With all the high profile that CAG is getting these
Yeah,
days,
absolutely.
I know what they do and what kind of professional work they do.
So
I
this
am
question
aware
of
of
that.
that.
Absolutely.
Just to give you an input.
Yes, I do agree. I completely agree.
Yes,
Actually, given a high current account deficit and the high public debt, don't you think it's really premature to talk about full convertibility?
Oh, I am, but I fully agree. I'm not saying now at all.
However, I mean, if we grow 6, 7, 8% for the next 20 years, I'm sure, and already, even today, there is virtual for the current account transactions. There is Rupee converted for all your current account transactions. It's only on the capital account that it's not. But the corporates, they have a way of
I'm afraid to say I don't think that's going to happen. I think 300 million, if we came back in 100 years' time, India on this path will still have 300, 400, 500 million people living in deep poverty. I think, frankly, that we might make an argument that Marx was right in that respect. There's Marx and Milton Friedman both agreeing in my work, because the wages are kept low by the fact that we've got this enormous poor population in the rural areas. They're not poor the climate is agreeable, the soil is productive, there's no famine, as it were. People are able to reproduce, people are then able to migrate to the cities. And that migration is keeping wages down. So that migration causes certain sectors like IT or whatever to become export sectors. So what we've done is we've created two economies. One economy, which is the export sector, with everybody who has access to the outside world, and then we've got everybody else who has this debauched currency which can be produced unendingly. And West Bengal's public finances are the same. I could describe that, or any of the states. I've got all the states in my machine, in fact. But it's been, to come back to the question about data, it is impossibly difficult. You have to go and find it from this office or that office, and it is impossibly difficult to find. And having found it, you have to put it on the computer. You have to try to understand it. It's almost as if people do not want to know. I have to say.
Even if you find the data, how authentic is the data? You don't know.
Well, it adds up. CAG data adds up. CAG data on all the states add up. CAG data on the on the union government adds up. So it all adds up. But when you do that, as I've shown you, you see peculiarities. So if I was Mr. Kejriwal, or the Naxals, I've said this to the Naxals too, the Naxals are very upset with the whole situation. And I said, look, the way to fight this is not through guns, it's through Excel sheets and data. You have to know where the money is going. So, for example, if I show you that so much money is going for land revenue collection, a collection of land revenue in Maharashtra, it's absurd. UP has budget shows all kinds of peculiar things as well. West Bengal the same. So, capital city development. So, once you start looking at these things and you treat it in a managerial way, you can find where you want to attack corruption, because there are peculiarities coming out of the data.
Come to the capital C, corruption.
Well, it has. So information too.
These roads will lead there only.
Yeah. So I'm happy to continue after it formally ends.
Are there any other questions on this? I can see the hand.
It's a very
Please.
scholarly discussion, and I'm not an economist, but the way I hear it is that there is almost a collusion between the industry, the corporate industry, and the government, and then that is manipulating the currency for the common man. Did I understand that correctly?
That's true, except I'm not a conspiracy theorist. I think the outcomes arise which are awful for reasons which, economists would say everyone's acting in self-interest. So the self-interest assumption is universal. There's no Mahatma Gandhi anywhere. Mother Teresa's once in a century, and so on. Everybody else is acting in his or her own interest. Organizations coalesce. They become groups. The groups attempt to take things over. So there's a whole theory of public finance which is related to organizations and coalitions of interests coming in and essentially bamboozling those who are not either informed or organized or able to coalesce together to battle it out. So I would say, yes, that is right, except there's no conscious coalition. Nobody's sat around a table and said, right, let's do this. It's just the way it evolved. And what I'm trying to say is that it evolved long ago. It evolved during the Second World War, when the British taught us how to monetize deficits. And we fought that. Sethi Deshmukh fought it specifically. And having fought it, then that whole mechanism became transferred and became socialist planning or whatever, pseudo-socialist planning I'd call it. And that process has not been comprehended. And the government does have a budget constraint. It's different from your budget constraint, my budget constraint in one respect. Namely that if you and I go into deficits, we have to borrow from somebody who knows us. In their case, in the government's case, they can print money. And that printing of the money is something which has been going on in an unconscious, uncontrolled, unknown method. There's nothing wrong in printing money, nothing wrong in having deficits, as long as you know what you're doing. As long as, not you, but everybody knows what's going on.
How does that differ from the U.S. model, where there's also some indication that they're printing a lot of money?
Well, incidentally, I'll just say that the U.S. is, I'm a Keynesian in the West and a hardline conservative in India. But in the West, it is not such a problem. It is, you could, even now, I differed with my Republican friends because they make almost a fetish of G equals T, that we must have balanced budgets and so on. And really, if I put my Keynesian hat on from my professor, I was a friend of Milton Friedman's who stood for me in the US court, and I'm the student of Frank Hahn, who was a Keynesian from Cambridge. If I put the Keynesian hat on, I would say, if you have very large unemployment, which the US does at the moment, or underemployment and real structural change going on, and a lot of hardship with the collapse of the housing market and so on, I think you have to realize that the debt is something to be paid far away. It's for future generations to be paying. In the Indian case, it's different because our currency is not convertible. So what's happening is as I said, the banking assets are being eroded and corroded over time. Whereas there, if there was a problem, it would be shown, because the currency is convertible, it would show up in the exchange rate. So I've said that the dollar is not at any particular risk, because the dollar is a reserve currency which everyone does hold, and the Americans use that fact. The fact that they have seniorage using the fact that they are the reserve currency and everybody has to hold their currency, or wants to hold their currency.
Any other questions?
We can continue afterwards.
Yeah, we sure. Well, thank you very much. I must thank Dr. Roy. And if I may summarize in 3 lines, his remedy for the rupee is A, good accounting principles using IT, number 2, the Ulysses Pact, and number 3, the Mohr, which he expects in 5 or 10 years would hearten the currency, hearten the rupee, and bring some sense to government accounting. Thank you. Thank you very much, Dr. Roy.
Thank you.
Thank you.
No, that was a brilliant summary.
Not a